Hi there, everyone. Coming up on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, we've got all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE. Plus, we're talking about this recent court case involving special education and independent study. Two guests on the show today to take us through that court case and what comes next.
Hey, Naj, I think this is the hardest part of the show every week here. Michael, let's get this going. The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
And it's just after 1 o'clock as we welcome you on a Wednesday to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Edgar Zazwata, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Welcome back after a week off. Thank you so much for being with us. We're honored to have you. Go ahead and jump onto our chat today. Say hello. Edgar, how are you after a week off?
I'm good. You say week off. Every time you say week off, you make it sound like we're not working, like we're not doing anything. It was a week off from our folks seeing us here for a week. But actually, I had a really good week because I still feel like I'm on a high from seeing a lot of our members in person, like in actually flesh and bones. And, it was a little tough. I know everybody wearing masks in San Francisco, as we should be there per local ordinances. But it was hard to recognize some folks right off the bat. It took a little bit, that like awkward, I think I know you. I think I recognize your voice. I recognize your eyes. But all that, it was good. It was good to see a lot of our folks, who tune in every week. So we had a good week.
We definitely had a good week. Edgar is referring to ACSA Leadership Summit, which was last Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in San Francisco. We were so happy to see so many of you there. If you were at the summit, thank you so much for being there. We had almost 800 people between the in-person and the virtual. So that was great. It was, again, great to have the members. And I'll bring up two things. One, Edgar and I get mistaken for each other quite often. Even without the masks, we get mistaken for each other. I was quite impressed that you and I went till about 5 o'clock on Friday before somebody thought that I was you. And wouldn't it just be fitting that it was a longtime ACSA leader that made the mistake? But it's my understanding several members wanted photos of you and your autograph. Did I hear that correctly?
I think Naj may be embellishing there a bit. First of all, we won't call out our member who did confuse us. It was a long day. It could happen, but we're not gonna forget that. I don't think. And like I said, it was good seeing some of our members, took a couple pictures. I was flattered. That, folks actually enjoy tuning in. They think that this is a valuable resource. So it was fun. It was fun getting some of that feedback.
I will say this. It wasn't our president, Charlie Hoffman, who was on the chat today. It was not Charlie. But again, another longtime ACSA leader made the mistake. Let me say one other thing. A little bit of a missed opportunity that I think we have to address is the fact that in the ACSA store, we didn't have any of our ACSA Legislative Lunch Break gear, which you and I now have. We have the mugs. Perhaps next year we need to do that. And perhaps what we can do, much like a book signing, is with all of your fans, we can have, you sign the mugs for them.
Nosh has all kinds of ideas, all these marketing ideas. Well, I'm sure we'll have somebody here at ACSA start working on that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, I want to say hello to Philip and Laura. So good to have you guys. Robert, John Ledoux, who I spoke with last week. Amy and James on with us as well. Mark Campbell from over at Calaveras Unified. Saw him last week. So good to see all of you here on the chat. We're so happy to have you. We'll talk about special education and independent study coming up in just a couple of moments with our guests. Edgar, I do want to refer to Governor's news conference earlier today. Governor Newsom, Senator Padilla, Health and Human Services Secretary Dr. Mark Galley held a news conference today promoting vaccinations and booster shots. I just want to give you guys a little bit of information that came from that. The group still cautioning against a potential spike in numbers with the coming winter months. Important to increase immunity by getting a booster shot, reminding everyone of the opportunity to get their first shot. Case rates are starting to rise with COVID-19, especially in some areas, as reported during this news conference. Last year, people dropped their guard down around the holidays, and that's when we started to see another spike again. Mark Galley said, statistical-wise, as of this morning, more than 110,000 youths ages 5 through 11 have received their first shot, and there are 1.6 million shots available to that age group. And with the approval of vaccines available for youth 5 through 11, this means 9% more of our state is able to get vaccinated now versus 1 week ago. All right, so Edgar, some data that came from this news conference earlier today. You and I and all of our viewers know it was this time last year, right around Thanksgiving, where people started getting together. We saw that increase in positivity rates. It's something that we still have to monitor, still have to be cognizant of as we move through these last couple of months of the year.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to have a little bit of flashback of like we've been here before. It was last October, right around Halloween, where we had some of the lowest rates, and I felt like we had that period of time where we thought, hey, maybe this is the beginning of the end, only to have things turn up as we got past Halloween and into the November and December holidays. And I think the state officials are definitely drawing that air of caution again this year. And because we've seen kind of how COVID works and it goes in these cycles, unfortunately, we're seeing some of those early signs of potentially where we may be right at the brink of things starting to tick up again. Obviously, a lot of different variables than what we had last year with the number of folks vaccinated, with obviously vaccinations now available to younger kids. So hopefully that really stifles some of the surge that we saw last year. But to all the questions we get about face coverings and, what was some of these things, what's the end game? Unfortunately, I think this is going to be some of the reasons that maybe the state kind of takes a very deliberate and slow approach to actually changing some of those requirements.
Yeah, I think that that these next few weeks are certainly going to be interesting to see how things maneuver here in the state now that vaccinations are available for the 5 through 11-year-olds. But as people gather, we will wait and see how things move. Daniel Thigpen with us today. Ann is with us today. Deanna, Angela Shell. I do have to say this. On our Twitter account, there is a picture of Angela from when she was over at the membership booth over at the Leadership Summit. As soon as I saw it, I said, God, I got to track down Angela and thank her for watching. She mentions right there, missed you though, Naj. So I'm going to have to make sure next time I'm a little bit more on top of that. Ellen Wheeler and Irela Perez also with us. Edgar, let's go ahead and talk special education. Let's talk about independent study because we had a court case. We had some court activity involving both of those, that subject matter and how they're going to work together. Let's bring in our guest right now. Carolyn Jones is senior reporter over at EdSource, and Jonathan Read is the attorney over at F3 Law. That's Fagen, Friedman, and Fulfrost, focusing on student services and special education. Carolyn and Jonathan, so good to have you here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Carolyn, let me start with you. EdSource has done some good reporting on the challenges of serving students with disabilities who do not return for in-person learning. What did you find by speaking to parents and other stakeholders? First, what happened in court? And also, what did you find in talking with the parents and other stakeholders?
Sure. I mean, I'll start with talking about what some parents and some families were facing. When the independent study law passed over the summer and kids started returning to school, there's some kids in special ed who are not able to go back to school in person. Either they are immunocompromised or they have, cognitive or developmental disabilities that prevent them from wearing masks, or in some case, in-person school was not going to work for them. But they weren't allowed to do independent study unless it was specified in their IEP, the individualized education program. So there's these kids out there that were kind of caught in limbo, and that sort of set in motion this complaint and the lawsuit that was filed in October.
Hey, John. Well, first, a shout out to Carolyn, because I love you. Obviously, you're reporting at EdSource, so obviously a resource to our folks. And I'm enjoying the new podcast you folks have, the Education Beat, which I know you also did a story on the challenges with folks trying to access services for students with disabilities under independent study. So it's another great resource for the field if folks haven't checked it out. Jonathan, shifting gears from a legal aspect, I know since really independent study came about and we were having these statutory conversations, these policy conversations here in the spring, the question about how to serve kids with disabilities under independent study, as Carolyn said, those that can't make it back to in-person learning for one reason or another, has been a big source of conversation. So set the framework for us first, before we even get into what happened last week in this court case. Going back to just the adoption of an independent study, what did the statute kind of entail as it relates to kids with disabilities? And what was the intent there in terms of how are we supposed to serve some of these kids with IEPs under independent study? What did the statute tell us?
Sure. And actually, if you don't mind, if I could go back even before the statute, because I think that really framed what the legislature did. There's always been a tension between equitable access to programs like independent study and federal law, the IDEA, which requires placement decisions to be made by IEP teams. And those placement decisions have to be in the least restrictive environment, which the IDEA defines as close to general education peers as possible. And so historically, there have always been allegations that, a parent should just simply be allowed to have their child in independent study. And the Office for Civil Rights has essentially said that, for children who qualify under the IDEA, placement is an IEP team decision. And so if the IEP team is not placing that child in independent study, that is not discrimination, right? But if a child is going to be in independent study, then the IEP team has to determine that the child can be educated appropriately in that context. And so that was a question of discrimination on the basis of access to a program. After COVID, the implications are much greater because it's not simply access to a program, it's equitable access to the same safety valve that parents of typical kids have. And so in passing AB 130, the legislature attempted to comply with that concern by making independent study available to all students, but for children on IEPs, that had to be made through the IEP process. And that has been the basis of the dispute since its passage.
Carolyn, in a recent article, you talked about disability rights groups filing a legal complaint asking the state to take a more active role in ordering districts to include special education students in independent study. You also noted that the state recently upgraded its guidelines as a result. So set the stage for us. What's happened since?
Well, the suit, there was a civil rights complaint filed with the U.S. Department of Justice as well as a lawsuit. And those were both filed in early October. And then after those were filed, the state updated their guidelines online, basically just saying what they had been saying all along, which is also what the federal government was saying. Just remind districts, you have to comply with special ed laws, regardless of whether a child is in independent study or in person or what have you. Which they've been saying all along, and they've just kind of reiterated that. So, and they also put out the state put out, frequently asked questions to kind of help districts and help parents kind of navigate all this complicated stuff. I think it was about last week, a judge did rule in the case. It gave a preliminary ruling, granted a temporary restraining order, saying that the district's name of the students that were in the plaintiffs in the lawsuit, those districts had to provide independent study with special ed services to those students. And there's a hearing scheduled for late November, I think on the 30th, where the judge will revisit it and is expected to extend that to the entire state, not just those 15 districts.
Jonathan, so as Carolyn mentioned, there was this ruling last week, and we've been getting the question a lot. I'm sure you have. Okay, so what are the implications? What does it really mean for how we're serving kids at the present moment, and what could it mean moving forward? And do we foresee changes, or how will the field have to adapt based on these new developments?
Boy, that's a great question, and really the reason it's such a good question is because regardless of what we want to happen or what our communities want to happen, there's still a federal law that requires placement decisions to be made by IEP teams, and we can't have a state law that contradicts that or provides an end run around that. And so either you have a mechanism within the law of allowing families of children with disabilities access to that same safety valve in an equitable manner, or you scrap the law. And both of those seem to have significant implications, because if the temporary restraining order is extended to apply to all districts in California, then essentially what that's saying is that there has to be virtual instruction available to those students as it was prior to AB 130. Now, the challenge, of course, is that all of those teachers and service providers that were providing virtual instruction back then are now in the classroom. And there's staffing issues irregardless of any law or court decision. And so how do you make that happen realistically? That's a question that I don't think anyone knows the answer to at this point.
Jonathan, and you mentioned something, that there's not a week that goes by on here that we get some of the concerns or questions about what you just noted, the staffing shortage piece, right? Mm-hmm. And given that that's just a reality that every school is facing, it becomes more acute when we're talking about students with disabilities. So what's the interplay there in terms of if there's real challenges in terms of just even being able to serve them? At the end of the day, I guess the question for the field is, what do folks do in those cases?
Well, I mean, I can start out. You know, I think one of the questions I had about the court decision was that it was based on the conclusion that for the current school year, independent study through AB 130 is the only way that districts can get funding to educate students with disabilities independently. But the home hospital has always been available to students with medical needs. Carolyn mentioned students with more acute medical needs that may extend for periods of time. IEP teams have always been able to offer programs that are home-based and receive funding for that. So there are options available with respect to that. Having said that, and finally getting to your question, the laws exist regardless of our staffing and regardless of the amount of money that we have to apply to those programs. And so sometimes all districts can do is all they can do, which is recognize what's offered in an IEP and make a good faith effort to address those needs that are in the IEP.
And just want to make note of this, Angela and Carolyn and Derek and Christine, we are going to get to your questions. Just want to make sure that you guys know that we saw them come through. Carolyn, I want to just go back to that disability rights group that I asked you about earlier, because you solicited responses to the court order from those disability rights groups. What did they have to say? Have we heard much reaction from lawmakers as a response to their response?
Well, the disability rights groups are thrilled at the preliminary ruling, obviously, because they think that this is a really crucial first step in sort of taking care of this problem, which hopefully will be resolved, as soon as possible. The state responded that they immediately sent, forwarded an order to all the districts that are named in the lawsuit and said, you have to get on this right now. And other than that, it's just sort of a wait and see thing right now. Just like, you were all mentioning, there's a staffing shortage at districts, and there's a huge backlog on IEPs left over from the pandemic. And this is not going to happen overnight. Getting these IEPs to include independent study and then figuring out how it's all going to work. And then especially too, I imagine things are going to change over the next couple of months as more and more children are vaccinated. And I think a lot of requirements in that regard are going to be changing. So I think that things are in flux right now and probably not moving as quickly as people would like them to move, but there we are.
Jonathan, before we get to some of the questions that we got from the viewers, and you touched on this a little bit before, when something like this comes out, obviously our folks with so much on their plates this year, you know, they're just struggling. Okay, how do we navigate? Is this one other thing we have to do? What does this actually mean? We're in the middle of the school year. So what, just, you know, given some of the stress already in the field, what general advice, you know, are you folks giving your clients in terms of how to respond to is take a wait and see what happens from here? Obviously, this is a temporary restraining order. Who does it affect, and what should folks do, if anything, as a result of this?
Well, right now, the court order affects 11 of the 15 named plaintiffs in the case. And we're waiting to see, there's a hearing on November 30th to decide whether to turn the TRO into a preliminary or permanent injunction. And so right now, I'm not sure there's anything that districts can do other than be cognizant of the implications in the fact that we may be required to provide distance learning in some manner to students after November. Until then, I think, you know, all districts can really do is focus on making child-centered decisions. And I think that's, in my experience, that's the basis for why districts do what they do anyway. But if you kind of stick to that theme, even legally, these cases are presented before judges. And if you have a limitation on an ability to implement anything, if a judge gets a sense that you are doing your best to meet the needs of each particular child, you have the best opportunity to get some empathy from the judge and to come out with a ruling that's realistic.
Let me go to one of our viewer questions, Angela Shell, who I mentioned earlier, and Carolyn or Jonathan, either of you can chime in on this one. Angela asks, is there a foresee timeline for LEAs to implement like services and independent study for students with IEPs? Do we have some type of a timeline right now? Does that exist?
Jonathan, I don't know off the top of my head. Do you know, Jonathan?
Well, right now, under AB 130, independent study can't be implemented until an IEP says that that's what the program is going to be. And so it requires an IEP team decision. And then, as with any IEP, it just needs to be implemented as soon as possible following the IEP. I also know a lot of districts are trying to work with families to enter into agreements, side agreements to make that happen. And again, it's just a matter of getting an agreement and then having a reasonable amount of time to get things going.
Hey, Jonathan, we'll try to play Stump the Attorney here for a second because you know, I get nervous anytime our folks start citing EdCode. I was like, okay, maybe I get nervous too. So Stephen Hovey asked, and he references EdCode there at 48206, but what he's referring to, individual instruction, can it be used to provide services to special needs students or quarantine students? So I don't know if you know the specific reference there, but he's getting at how would this impact them in these particular circumstances?
I don't know the particular code section off the top of my head, so I will admit that from the get-go.
Geez, Jonathan, I'm disappointed. You didn't come right off and know what that one was.
Well, actually, I'll be honest. When I first heard that I was going to be participating in this, I thought you wanted me here to play guitar. So, but if you have legal questions, I'll go with it. Generally, the IDEA requires IEP teams to come up with placement decisions. And it's the IEP team that binds a district to doing whatever it is the IEP team has recommended. And so in that sense, once the IEP team has decided to do something, it's up to the district to figure out how to do it, regardless of the funding source.
Let me ask Amy Wynn Hernandez, based on this judgment, no more need for IEP meetings to change placement from in-person to independent study. Jonathan, any chance you might be able to address that?
That's not correct right now. Right now, to change a placement, regardless of whether it's independent study or any other placement, that has to be an IEP team decision. There's some question, and the only effect of this temporary restraining order is for these 11 students to have them placed in their placement that existed prior to July of 2021 until there's a hearing. So right now the status quo exists for the vast majority of students. There is an argument that, just like we had in the beginning of COVID, you could implement an existing IEP virtually without having an IEP meeting. And that's kind of one of the core issues that the court's going to have to grapple with, because that existed in the time of schools being shut down and not having any other alternative to implement a program. But now that we do have alternatives, the question comes down to whether or not a parent can drive that decision over where an IEP is implemented. But absent that issue, placement's an IEP team decision, so an IEP team has to convene and make that decision.
Oh, did we lose Edgar? Edgar, did you hit mute? I think he hit mute.
I didn't. Am I back?
Yes, you are back now.
It's been a while since we made a rookie mistake like this. We're still learning, apparently.
That's right.
Jonathan, I was going to throw one more question at you from Derek. Then the question was, will we also owe compensatory services if the parents have not been sending their children to school because the IEP team determined that fate could not be met in independent study? So if they hadn't been sending these kids because of an early determination, how would that work?
So compensatory education is an equitable remedy, meaning essentially that it's based on notions of fairness. And so if a district were to be in a hearing or in court and the judge was to determine that the district, failed in some respect, a compensatory remedy might be available. But the court could also consider the fact that the district had educational services available and the parent chose not to avail the student of that. So it would really depend on, a particular case and what has gone on. But absent that, the fact that we've had services available at school and we have a law that has a specific mechanism that we're following to provide services, I don't think would automatically require districts to offer compensatory remedies or services to address learning loss or anything like that.
I'm going to ask a two-parter here. So Jonathan, I'll give you the first one, and then Carolyn, I'm going to have you answer the second one. Jonathan, your question from Michelle. So to clarify, this is just a watch for California now, and we are not required to provide distance learning for students that want IDS. That's Jonathan, that's for you. And then Carolyn, after Jonathan, I'm interested to just hear what you think the next steps are, what our members and other educators need to know as we continue to move forward through this process. Jonathan, I'll have you start.
So the short answer is yes, Michelle is correct. This is just a watch right now for California for anyone except for the school district serving those particular students. And so we don't have to provide distance learning to all students like we were in 2020. But we do have to provide a FAPE. And if a parent requests independent study, and the child qualifies, we still have to have an IEP team meeting to make that determination.
And Carolyn, next steps, what do our members need to know moving forward?
Well, I mean, one thing that's kind of interested me all along about this story is just the number of students who are involved. It's not a huge number of students. So, and I think the number might go down as time goes on and more students start feeling comfortable going back to school in person. So it might not be this huge game changer. It might just be something that districts can handle on a case-by-case basis. It might just be, you know, 1 or 2 kids in a district who are in this situation. So, and also I think that independent study will evolve as time goes on. So there'll be, you know, districts and teachers and families will be a lot more nimble as they kind of navigate this. So that's what I'm looking for in the next couple of months is how, you know, where we are in December, say, or January. And yeah, so that's what I'm looking for.
You know what, Carolyn, it's funny you say that where we are November, December, January. I literally feel like we say that every single show, no matter what the topic is. We'll see where we are in month X, Y, and Z. So we'll have you on right after month Z again, so you can just update us on everything. Carolyn Jones, Carolyn Jones, senior reporter over at EdSource, Jonathan Read, attorney over at Fagen, Friedman, and Fulfrost. To both of you, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you on the show, and we'll see you next time. All right, Edgar. So a lot of questions today, which I'm very happy to see. I just want to get your thoughts just to summarize this, because obviously, as Carolyn said, so much more to really look at November, December, January. Things might evolve. Things could take a right turn and change. But just from what you heard from the both of them, give me your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it makes me reflect on almost how we started this conversation about where are we going to go from here. And it really starts with the COVID front, right? The numbers that you were talking about at the top of the show about what happens with case rates. We've been getting the question a lot lately about what's the future of independent study? Yeah. Are some of these provisions going to continue on? A lot of what the legislature and the governor did last year, it only applied for 1 year. Now, what will happen after this current school year, I think will depend on what's happening with COVID, and if more families are comfortable coming back and continue to want to stay in school, then that might change that dynamic. With that said, I think the big variable here is what happens this winter, what happens with the surge, what happens if we have more families who are wanting to access independent study. And so what is then the ramifications for these kids with disabilities? So I think there's a lot of, we use this phrase a lot as well. We're going to have to wait and see how all this develops.
Yeah, you know what? We need to put that on the other side of the mug for the ACSA Legislative. We'll wait and see how this goes. Edgar, good seeing you today, man.
Good to be back. Even though I said there was no break, we were working, even though you tried to say, you know, not much of a break, but it's good to be back into the swing of things.
That's right. Hey, folks, thanks so much for watching us here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We're here on Wednesdays, 1 p.m. live and interactive on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great rest of the day and great rest of the week, and we'll see you next time.